Commissioner is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School. Commissioner also serves as chair of the board of directors of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And as I said, I will be short, so I'm going to welcome Commissioner Dykes to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's great to be with everyone today and be here in person. I know this is an event that shifted to virtual or got disrupted by the pandemic, and with the end of the emergency, I think it was announced yesterday, it's timely to be back in person. We know how important these gatherings are to strengthening our relationships, sharing information, and recommitting ourselves to all of the work that we're doing jointly to help protect and expand our forests and address some of the key impacts and challenges that we're facing. I just am so proud of our DEEP team. I know we have a number of DEEP staff who are here today. Andrea Urbana, who you heard from, is an example of just one of the many stars that we have on our DEEP team. And everywhere I go, it's amazing to me how much our team is able to accomplish with so few staff. I also see in some of the in the audience here some of the key champions who've been helping to tell the story of how important it is for DEEP to have adequate staffing, including in our forestry division and across all of our branches, to be able to do the kind of supportive work that we need to do to share technical information and of course be good stewards of our state forests and strengthen our partnerships. It is really remarkable. I love those stats that Andrea shared. 14th most forested state in the country, 4th densest state in the country, and that makes our challenges and opportunities around forestry really unique in the state of Connecticut. I just want to kind of pull back the lens a little bit. Climate change is one of the key challenges that we're tackling, that we face in our state and of course across our planet. And Connecticut has, for several decades now, been a leader in climate change policy and legislation. Part of the reason, I often get asked, Commissioner Dykes, we're such a small state. Why does it matter if Connecticut is really pushing at the forefront of our climate policies? And the answer is that when we demonstrate what's possible here, it has ripple effects and it proves out models and approaches that can be picked up by other jurisdictions around the country. But I have to say that, the privilege that we've had and that title, sort of climate leader, is not something that is a one and done. And while in 2008, Connecticut was a leader in enacting the Global Warming Solutions Act, which committed us to achieving an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide by 2050. We re-upped that and strengthened that with a midterm target of achieving a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That was enacted in 2017. But unfortunately, it feels to me like our crown is slipping a little bit. And strangely, as we begin to see these impacts of climate change unfolding around us and impacting our forests, impacting our communities, I would have thought that it would be strengthening the resolve of our legislators and many of our key stakeholders to go further and go faster in reducing emissions. And I just have to be honest, we're kind of at a sobering moment where we are seeing those impacts, but at the same time, some of our efforts to advance legislation to catch up to where we need to be in terms of achieving our targets has not received a warm reception in the legislature. Just a few weeks ago, we shared a report tracking how we're doing in meeting the targets that Connecticut has already set in statute. That 45% reduction by 2030 is ambitious but necessary to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, we are not going to meet that 2030 target with the policies and programs that we have currently in place. We have been making a lot of progress in reducing emissions in the power sector. And that's where we've had the most robust and long-standing programs for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, from deploying renewables, building transmission, and also now being able to take advantage of a lot of federal funding and tax tax credits available from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law that are making clean electricity, clean energy options even more affordable. So we're continuing to make progress in that regard. But at the same time, we have our transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and boy, is that a stubborn sector. Most of those emissions are coming from internal combustion engine vehicles. The vast majority of those emissions in the transportation sector. We've done a lot in partnership with the EPA and California standards to improve our fuel economy of our internal combustion engine vehicles. So we're getting more miles per gallon of fossil fuels. At the same time, we're driving more. And so that has pretty much cannibalized all the progress that we've made in the fuel economy is getting compromised by the fact that we're increasing our vehicle miles traveled. We have great opportunities to continue to ratchet down those emissions in the transportation sector with policies to shift to electric vehicles, including the Connecticut Clean Air Act to increase incentives for EVs, as well as federal tax credits that have been re-upped and extended under the Biden administration. So we need to do more to tackle those the greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. But this is a forestry related event, so why am I talking about cars? Well, because it has a real nexus to trees and forests. Because again, if we really are, if we know that tackling vehicle miles traveled, the amount of driving we have to do is has to be at the top of our policy priority list, then that starts to bring into play a lot of land use decision making in our state. Urban sprawl, right? Extending our suburban communities out further and further into our forest habitat is one of the things that is causing people to have to drive farther and farther distances to, get to school, get to work, get to the grocery store. So we need to continue to invest in policies that support transit-oriented development, revitalizing our city centers. Deep is an amazing place to work. We have an incredible benefit and advantage in our state because we have our environmental quality and our natural resource and our energy planning and programs all under one roof. So we can really tackle these things in a comprehensive way. And that means that we're pushing harder on remediation programs to bring brownfields back into productive reuse, that we're working with our Department of Transportation on expanding access to bike paths and other types of non-driving options for people to get around. But it also means supporting some of the recommendations of the Perfect Future Report that these folks may be familiar with. It came out of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and I know we had some really key stakeholders helping us develop policy recommendations for how we can move towards a no net loss of forest policy. And there's lots of different ways to accomplish that, but I see that as an important pillar of how we can also tackle greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector to the extent that we can really start to begin to internalize and put in proactive policies that encourage retaining forests and forests. That's a really important tool for us to ensure that we're focusing development and revitalization in urban centers and more densely populated areas so we can avoid continuing with sprawl that contributes to more greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really how all of these things are kind of related. Of course, there's a lot of different policies that are embedded in that no net loss approach. And it's going to take some time to get legislative support and adoption for these things. Some of them will require some commitment of funding, especially if we're thinking about offsetting programs to mitigate and offset the costs of tree cutting or clearing that may happen on state lands, for example. But one of the policies that really resonant for me from the Perfect Future Report related to no net loss starts with a commitment to equity and environmental justice in prioritizing the retention and expansion of vegetation cover in our overburdened communities, in our environmental justice communities. While we are the 14th most forested state in the country, we also, in many of our city centers, have some of the lowest vegetation cover in low-income neighborhoods. And that's something that is really unacceptable, it's unjust, it's inequitable, and it's something that we can really tackle. And I'm really proud that DEEP has been able to fund grants for our urban forestry programs, starting off with investing in community organizations to build capacity for community organizations to be able to get grants, apply for grants, get grants, and ultimately get federal funding because the Inflation Reduction Act includes a significant amount of federal funding for urban forestry and other forestry programs. So I'm really thrilled with the leadership and encouragement of our urban forestry staff and other key stakeholders. We were able to allocate $1 million from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a program where we are requiring fossil fuel power plants to pay for their pollution, and we're taking those payments from fossil fuel power plants and recycling it into this grant program for urban forestry. So it's a really great story, and that's enabled us to support and build capacity in our community organizations so that they're prepared now to be able to deliver on some of the federal funding that's coming to expand vegetation cover. But part of this story is also involves the legislature. At the agency's request, the legislature raised a bill, 979, which is still alive and which would establish a target of expanding forest cover in our environmental justice communities that have disproportionate lack of vegetation cover by 5%. And so we think that that's a really important target. It's also going to help us address a whole host of other issues because we know the heat island effect in urban communities. When you lack that tree cover, you're going to be experiencing higher temperatures. We know that those communities are also communities that are and there's certain of these processes and impacts that are becoming irreversible, and we know how profound those impacts are going to be from a public health standpoint, from an ecological standpoint, from an economic standpoint, and Andrea really captured that really well. So it's incredibly sobering, but it's really important to know that there is still so much of this story about what happens with climate change that has not yet been written and depends on the actions of all of us in this room today. And so that includes getting involved in the political process, engaging not just at the federal level, but with our state legislatures, with our local communities, to ensure that we're doing all of that we can to reduce emissions and also preparing our communities for the impacts of climate change. So I spoke about Connecticut's leadership in the past, and it's something not to be taken for granted. Our 80% by 2050 emissions target is now out of date. Based on the latest science, we know that at the international level and at the state level, national level, policymakers need to be adopting targets that are more along the lines of a net zero carbon emission target by 2050. We proposed that in an agency bill, Senate Bill 1145, and unfortunately that bill was killed in the Appropriations Committee just last week, which is really disheartening because I don't think that's what Connecticut is about. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, other states around us have adopted this this net zero by 2050 target, and we have to catch up. We have to have planning targets that are consistent with the science. That's really what leadership is all about. And leadership is not resting on your laurels and sort of standing still, but listening to the scientists and adapting our targets to where they need to be in order to meet those goals. So we'll continue to be doing our planning and further analyzing how the pathways to meet a net zero target by 2050. But I just have to say this in this room, that as we're working through the impacts of climate change in forests, it's really incumbent on all of us who understand the gravity of the climate crisis to also get engaged in the political process and make sure that Connecticut is continuing to be a leader in reducing emissions on track with what the science recommends. I think that that's also just critical from the standpoint of, the faster we reduce emissions, we can't prevent climate change from happening. It is here. It is happening. But it's up to us and on us now to determine just how bad we're going to allow it to get. And we still have time to put in place carbon mitigation programs that will stave off some of the worst scenarios and worst impacts of climate change later in this century. And so it's really, really important that as we're working to adapt and prepare for the impacts of climate change, that we're also speaking up and getting involved and endorsing policies that will reduce those emissions as fast as possible. With the advent of federal funding, we know that those climate mitigation measures are even more affordable than ever. And so there's really no excuse for us to not be putting these kinds of policies in place. I also want to note that a net zero target brings into scope emission reduction and mitigation opportunities that are associated with land use. And so we have not to date really been inventorying the emissions related to conversion of forests or retention of carbon emissions, stored or sequestered in our forests related to our agricultural and land use policies. And so that's why this net zero target really matters for the folks in this room, because it will for the first time enable us to start to track how we're doing in managing those forests, which, as you know, we have a lot of forests in Connecticut, so we have an important role to play from a forestry perspective and a land use perspective in supporting carbon storage and sequestration. So we're going to continue to be doing the science and be doing the developing the frameworks to be able to measure those types of dynamics in forests, in land use. But we need to have in statute the targets that will then ensure that we can take all those analytical tools and actually translate them into policy, into programs, and be able to begin to move the needle and have our various programs and regulations start to fall in line with what the science is telling us that we need to do. Elsewhere in the Northeast and frankly across the country, we, our other states have targets for greenhouse gas mitigation. They're now becoming more ambitious than ours, as I mentioned. We need to catch up there. In addition, those other states also have regulatory authority to enact the regulations and the policies and programs necessary to meet the targets. And in other states, the targets are actually enforceable, including by citizen suit. And I just need you to understand that in Connecticut, we only have targets. The legislature has not been supportive of providing for state agencies to be able to enact the regulations necessary to meet the targets. Even though Connecticut is uniquely one of only 2 states in the country that requires all regulations to then be explicitly approved by the legislature after they're developed before they can go into effect. So Connecticut has the most stringent guardrails in terms of the legislature specifically approving regulations, but one of the key pushbacks on this Senate Bill 1145 is that it would have authorized DEEP to develop these regulations for the legislature to consider, and that itself would seem to be a bridge too far for the legislature to even empower the agency to develop these regulatory proposals, let alone being able to have citizens and organizations be able to enforce and bring suit and challenge if state agencies are not enacting the tools and programs necessary to meet the targets. So, I just need everyone to understand where we stand. I think this information is not widely understood, but I begin to see that other states around us in the Northeast are pulling away. They're getting closer to meeting their 2030 targets. These are not targets, it's not like homework you can do, the morning of. You have to be on track and have the programs in place now in order to make the progress necessary to get to those targets in 2030. And standing here in 2023, I can tell you that we have very little time to get these frameworks in place here at the state level if we're going to be able to meet those 2030 targets. The good news is that we have all this federal funding available under the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And that funding is going to go to the states that put the programs in place that make those, ensure that those dollars are deployed. The federal approach under the Biden administration is really unique and interesting because they're basically putting carrots on the table. They're saying, here are all the carrots, here's all the funding to make these technologies affordable. But it really is up to states and up to communities about whether to put in place the sticks or the programs or the policies or whatever it is to ensure that those carrots are going to be eaten. And so that's the role, the complementary role that states need to play. Just putting out tax credits is not a self-fulfilling, it does not automatically ensure that the programs get delivered. It takes a whole host of things to be put in place, from capacity building for organizations to deploy these different tools and programs, from state agencies adequately staffed to be able to allocate grants and support technical assistance, all the way to the spectrum of having metrics like a no net loss of forest program or a net zero carbon target to track your progress and ensure that you're investing your dollars in places where they're effective and having the impact. So we're prepared and eager within the Lamont administration to be able to do our part at the agency level and across government. I do want to note how incredible our Department of Agriculture has been and working on these issues in partnership with us and so many other agencies, the Governor's Council on Climate Change. We have amazing participation from so many different stakeholders to help us develop the plans. We know what to do, but we need to have the regulatory framework, the statutory frameworks that provide us with the tools to ensure that we do it. So I will keep fighting. We are really excited about what can come out of this session. Certainly, we hope to get that 5% target for urban forestry enacted. We also are going to be working hard after the session on a comprehensive policy approach, working with the Department of Transportation, the Office of Policy Management with respect to the Plan of Conservation Development, really putting together all the pieces around how to support transitory development and development that's consistent with keeping our forests as forests. And I can't wait to bring some of that policy work to all of you and to the meetings doing that. But I just want to underscore how important this moment is. We are writing the future. It's going to be a big challenge, but how challenging the climate crisis becomes is up to all of us. And it's not too late. There's a lot that we can do. And we happen to be in a state that is at the forefront and that it is an essential driver of climate policy. If we don't do it here, it's not going to happen elsewhere. And we have the tools, we have amazing partners like all of you to help us prove out and develop these policies and programs. And so I know that we can do it. We just need to have the support of our legislative leaders and key stakeholders to give us the tools necessary to do it. And I know that's why I'm excited to have the opportunity to continue serving as the commissioner at DEEP, and I'm excited about what we can all accomplish together. I'm so proud of our staff who are working on these key issues, and I look forward to continuing our great engagement with Rockfall Foundation and all of you as we work towards this future. So thank you so much for letting me be part of your discussion this morning and for everyone being here working on these really critical